President Trump says he's ending trade talks with Canada, and he's expected to announce a new tariff rate on the country in the days ahead. Now, Mr. Trump took to Truth Social to make the announcement, saying in part, quote, "We have just been informed that Canada, a very difficult country to trade with, including the fact they have charged our farmers as much as 400% tariffs for years on dairy products, has just announced that they are putting a digital services tax on our American technology companies, which is a direct and blatant attack on our country." He goes on to say, based on the egregious tax, we are hereby terminating all discussions on trade with Canada effective immediately. For more on this, I want to bring in White House reporter Aaron Navarro. Okay, so break this down for us. I know that this is breaking for you, too. What more do we know right now?
Kelly, it really seems that it is that digital services tax from Canada, so taxes that are applied to American tech companies such as Amazon, such as Google, that really caught the ire of President Trump and lead him to say that they're terminating all discussions on trade with Canada effective immediately. In that post, he says that Canada is, quote, copying the European Union, who has also been considering this digital services tax on American companies should trade talks with the Trump administration go sour. This is all incredibly interesting, just given that Trump was just in Alberta, Canada, for that G7 meeting, had only praise to show the new Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, in the planning of that meeting. But the fact that he is saying that he might just give a letter establishing the tariff rate for Canada, that thought is not necessarily that new. When President Trump has been asked about this incoming July 9th deadline for his tariff plans, he's often said, you know, we can just make the deal whenever and set the tariff rates for these countries. We could send a letter to them saying that this is the tariff rate you have to pay if you want to do business with the United States. It just seems that now that Canada could be the first one to get one of those types of letters.
I think it's important that you bring up the European Union point because, you know, for those watching at home, one of the things that the president has really been frustrated with them, of course, is how hard they are on American tech companies, as you've mentioned, making it hard to do business, going after them with fines for antitrust issues. And we do know that it's not just about trade when it comes to doing these deals, whether it be with Canada, with the EU and other nations. It's also about protecting American business interests. So let's kind of play this out. We have seen a lot of back and forth when it comes to these trade policies and the trade deals. But if we were to go ahead with this unknown tariff rate that will be announced in a few days, what kind of implications do you think that would have on our relationship with the northern border?
Yeah, well, certainly, if you just look at the dynamic between the president and Canada in just the past couple of weeks, there have been these flashpoints where there have been points where Canada has said that they will have retaliatory tariffs on some of our tariffs on steel and aluminum. So this relationship, which is relatively new between the new Prime Minister and President Trump, was already somewhat on shaky ground. In fact, I remember hearing Prime Minister Carney not sounding that optimistic after his meeting here at the White House when it comes to the overall trade deal with the United States. And when you've heard the White House talk about their deals with countries, they mention obviously the one that they inked with the United Kingdom, the new one that we're learning a bit more about with China. They point to South Korea, India, Japan. They do not point necessarily to Canada. We have not heard a lot of talk from them talking about deals either with Mexico or neighbors down south. So this is just a continuation, potentially a more frayed relationship between the U.S. and Canada, especially if there's no other developments or any types of negotiations before the president issues that letter telling Canada, this is what you have to pay us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you kind of brought up the history of all of this because you and I have talked so many different times, you know, especially about Canada, right? There was all of that back and forth with Ottawa, and there was going to be a tax on electricity, and then days later, you know, they were going to retaliate against us, and then all of a sudden, a couple days later, oh, actually, we figured it out, things are okay. So based on your reading of all of the history of this back and forth, I mean, do you think that this could be a negotiation tactic?
No, it could be, especially because Trump seems to be really honed in on that digital services tax. That was announced. That was something that Canadian officials in the past couple of weeks have been teasing could happen. Should Canada remove that, you could see the president say, all right, let's come back to the negotiation table, similar to how earlier this year when the U.S. was going to have these big tariffs on Canada and Mexico specifically if they didn't, change their policy on immigration. You saw then Prime Minister Trudeau kind of tweak the plan plans to kind of suit what President Trump wanted when it comes to immigration from the northern border. So should Canada, change that tax, this could certainly be seen as a negotiating tactic. At the same time, it could also just be seen as President Trump being a bit impatient with how these trade deals are going and saying, I want to give the tariff rate, establish that with all of these countries anyways. Let's get that done before July 9th.
Yeah, July 9th. And of course, we heard the president today even say that that could be the date. It might
Longer,
not be.
Could be shorter.
Right,
yeah.
It could be shorter. And even in that same press conference, he said, I'd love to be able to just tell these countries, here's the tariff rate, here's what we're charging. And then he actually looked to the side. I think it was Treasury Secretary Bessent that was there with him. And he said, he wouldn't like that so much. Kind of a nod to the fact that even Wall Street investors look at Bessent as sort of the calming force in this. Back to the Canada of it all, though. I mean, you've done a lot of reporting on this. What's so important about our relationship with Canada? Is it the trade? Is it the security? I mean, I know we get a lot of oil from them. How important in terms of that trade relationship is it?
Oil, steel, especially aluminum from Canada, which we have already placed specific tariffs on, but that is core in the relationship between the U.S. and Canada, especially in some of those states in the north, thinking of Michigan, thinking of upper New York, that does a lot of trade specifically with Canada, or is at least very involved in that, physical aspect of trade. But you've seen President Trump, ever since he took office in the second term, really kind of dismiss the longstanding allyship between the U.S. and Canada. He has floated how Canada could become the 51st state. So, yes, historically, there's an importance in the trading relationship between the U.S. and Canada. With this administration, it doesn't seem like that importance is still there.
Yeah, I'm as you're talking, Aaron, I'm looking at the markets and how they're reacting to this. Because you know me, I'm the business girl. My mind goes, how do investors feel about this? And there's always that visceral reaction. And, we are still on track maybe to reach a high in the S&P 500, but we're starting to pull back. You can see up on your screen that the Dow is still up 0.5%, but you see that slide on the chart. Okay, that downward slide. We're still in the green for today, but right around 130, 145, that's when this news broke, and you start to see investors pulling back. Again, we're not falling off a cliff, but this is representative of a fear of, well, if we were going to have a schism in the relationship with our biggest trading partner, or even just higher costs for businesses, because think about it, we don't know what that tariff rate might be, but you have an import tax placed on that. That means that goods are going to be more expensive for businesses. What does that mean when it's an investor? That means that a company's bottom line is going to be impacted. And so, I bring that piece in because I think there's always that other component. It's the security, it's the trade relationship, it's the investors, what it means at home. And so I want to pose the question to you. I mean, you've done a lot of reporting on this as well as inflation. I mean, would there be some inflation concerns coming out of this if we had a tariff? Again, we don't know what the rate is. Right. But with China, given that we get so much of our goods from there.
Yeah, I mean, the potential is definitely there. But even just to broaden this out, the threat from President Trump to send this letter to Canada, what does that send to the rest of the countries that are still negotiating with the U.S.? You heard the president also say we might just give you a letter establishing our tariff rate. How does that impact the trade negotiations between the U.S. and the European Union, which we've heard, at least some good signs of in recent weeks? So that could certainly impact the overall tariff rate with countries beyond Canada, which could then impact our inflation rate, which the president has been watching closely ever since, that, quote, Liberation Day, where he introduced these worldwide, quote, reciprocal tariffs.
I'm glad you brought up the point about the negotiations with other countries, because I think that's an important piece of this. This is not just about Canada. We have all of these other nations watching around the world of how these things are unfolding and then likely taking insight of what might be coming for them next. So to that point, I want to ask you about what the big news of the day was when it came to trade before all of this, which was this framework of a deal with China. And just to remind viewers, we had a framework in a meeting in Geneva a few months ago, and then there was this recent meeting of the minds in London, and now it seems today that there is a deal. So expand on that. What do we know, Aaron?
At least I see this as an agreement on the framework that was negotiated in London earlier between U.S. officials and Chinese officials. And some of the top lines from the agreement that we at least know about as of now, the U.S. will be receiving more rare earth materials from China. Since that meeting in London, you've seen U.S. officials voice frustration with the speed at which China is exporting those rare earth materials, which can be used for smartphones, other key electronics. The speed at which that they were getting that to the U.S., it seems that the U.S. and China have come to an agreement for China to speed that up. In return, the U.S. Will not revoke the visas of students from China on American college campuses. They're taking away other countermeasures that have been in place on China. And for both countries, those 100% plus tariffs that they are placing on each other are still not taking effect. It is important to note that this may be just the next step in the process. President Trump, during his press conference earlier today, seemed to indicate that there's something coming down the line in terms of a fuller trade agreement with China. But as far as this week, that seemed to be the big flash surprise announcement that the president made during that event with congressional Republicans at the White House yesterday.
And if history teaches us anything, you go back to 2018. We had a deal with China, then we didn't, then we did. And it ultimately got resolved over a year later. Aaron, thank you so much for hanging out with us on this breaking news and giving your insights today. Appreciate it.
Take care.